Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. A lot of folks, it seems to me, are asking the question whether the Church will change her teaching on same-sex attraction, or more specifically, on same-sex marriage. So it's one of those situations where, you hear things being discussed in the news or in the media, and then you hear things being discussed in certain church circles, and it's not entirely clear, what is settled doctrine and what's up for grabs and what can I expect in 10, 100, 1,000 years. So in answer to this anxiety or in answer to this question, I thought that we could lay out some principles, map out some arguments, and then come to some conclusions regarding what the Church teaches and then how we as Christians can appropriate that teaching. So let's go for it. I thought that a good way in which to approach the question was first to distinguish between a genealogical way of explaining things and then a metaphysical way of explaining things. So when the secular world approaches questions like this one, it tells a story of kind of progressive evolution or ongoing enlightenment. It's like in the past, things were terrible and everyone had a toothache and we did barbaric things. But now we have technology and Western civilization and Hollywood, so we know things more and more perfectly with each passing day, and we all have come to acknowledge the fact that this is true. So get on board or be wholly and entirely marginalized. So what you have is a kind of story, and oftentimes that story is fueled by a therapeutic need to affirm everything or to affirm the next best thing. And when people don't assent to the story, then you have to marginalize those people. Because if you're not working with principles and if you're not rehearsing arguments, then you're not doing real rational discourse, all right? You're just trying to get people on your team, and if not everyone's willing to get on your team, then you have to silence those voices in whatever way you can. So that makes it really hard to discuss issues like this because they are very rarely conducted on even footing. And so it's more like battle or protest or unmasking than it is like discourse or like exchange. Whereas, I think the Church tries to set forth principles and then host arguments, host a kind of rational exchange and tell you, this is what we believe, and these are the reasons for which, and this is why it actually conduces to salvation. So the Church, is trying to give more of a metaphysical rather than a genealogical response, because the Church will teach that, we can have real access to what is, on the one hand, because we're made to have access to reality. And though, we're weak and wounded and our access to reality is diminished by sin, yet the grace of God can heal us and grow us so that we have yet better and better access to that reality. So, there may be certain historical dimensions to our appreciation of a particular point of doctrine, and we shouldn't set that aside because some ages might be better suited to receiving certain aspects of revelation which are given in our Lord Jesus Christ. So we hope to, improve in our reception of that doctrine, but it's all laid out in Christ, right? It's all made known in Christ. It's just a matter of our appropriating it or making it yet more explicit. But I don't think that we would want to espouse any notion of things are getting better and better, or we're coming into a yet more and more perfect expression of or reception of the Christian life. I think it's more like ups and downs. There aren't golden ages, there are just perilous times. So then when it comes to human nature, we would say that yes, we can know something about human nature. And when I use the word nature there, I'm using it in a kind of technical philosophical sense. It means basically a principle of both identity and of destiny. So in nature is the principle that accounts for what a thing is and then how a thing flourishes. So how it attains to its term or how it attains to its perfection. So when we say that we know something about human nature, we're saying both that we know what human beings are, but also how human beings should act or should live in order to attain to their perfection or completion as, members of the species. So we have access to this truth by reason. But that access, like we said, is also healed and elevated by grace. So our understanding is actually clarified. It's actually fortified by belief. It's not that it's obscured by belief or that it's set aside and then replaced by belief. But we would hold that the life of faith gives us yet more perfect access to what is, because we're inquiring into the same truth. And what faith does is it elevates our reason so that we can see in the light of God and of the blessed. So then when it comes to the church's teaching on the human person, you have this fundamental or basic truth that we are made to the image and likeness of God, okay? So that we are patterned on the Godhead and that we are capable of receiving the Godhead, all right? So God reveals himself, he gives himself, and we are made capable of that reception, and we are made capable of kind of replicating it, as it were, in our members. And that's something that applies to us body and soul. So in the church's tradition, we have the soul dimension emphasized most vehemently or most insistently. So here it's said often that we're made to the image of God by virtue of the fact that we have a spiritual nature, so that we have a mind with which to know and a heart with which to love. And those spiritual powers most closely approximate the divine nature itself. But it's peculiar of human beings that they are spirits embodied, right? Because God is not embodied. We're going to set aside considerations of the incarnation for a second. Angels are not embodied, but men and women are embodied. And so the image of God is something that suffuses our whole human nature. And this is something that St. John Paul II describes at great length in the Theology of the Body. So you can see in our bodies something of that image, which is to say that the life of reason, right, the life of knowing and loving, should suffuse every aspect of our humanity. And so St. John Paul II will talk about the nuptial meaning of the body, the fact that we are made to the image and likeness of God, and that's made to be expressed in communion, and specifically in the context of marriage, which is the natural vocation to which man is ordinarily called. So there wouldn't have been any priesthood in the garden, there wouldn't have been any religious life in the garden. We would have been called to marriage, and in the ordinary course we would have communicated life, and with that life would have come grace. Adam and Eve, had they not sinned, would have communicated a human nature to their offspring, and with that human nature, God would have given a kind of grace of rectitude or of original justice. So our lives, made to the image and likeness of God, are the chosen means, the chosen way by which the grace of God is meant to enter the created world, specifically the embodied world, and to reflect something of his glory and work towards the salvation of our souls. So we're a body-soul composite. We're made to the image and likeness of God, and that image suffuses every aspect of our humanity. So one way in which the church's tradition will attempt to kind of unpack this teaching is by describing it in terms of the natural law. So the eternal law, which is kind of God's plan for the well-ordering of all creation, is impressed in our nature as knowing and as loving, right? So as made to the image and likeness of God. And so we have a peculiar appreciation for, a peculiar expression of that natural law. And when St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the natural law, he says that you can observe it at the level of inclination. So again, nature is a principle both of identity and of destiny. So by virtue of the fact that we are this, we should do this, okay? And you can think of simple examples of how that is true, So by virtue of the fact that we have, skulls, which are pretty hard, but not terribly hard, we should wear helmets while riding a bike. Things like that, okay? But St. Thomas will say, okay, on account of the fact that we are a thing, a substance, we want to keep on existing. And so we're inclined, for instance, to eat and to drink, because otherwise we would perish. And then he'll go on to say, by virtue of the fact that we're animals, all right, we're inclined to the procreation and education of children. So we're inclined to sexual intercourse and to family life. Because not only do we want to live ourselves individually, but we want to live ourselves as a species, right? So we want to communicate this life to subsequent generations of offspring, and we want to build up family structures in which to initiate subsequent generations into that life. And then he'll go on to say, but by virtue of the fact that we're rational, right? So by virtue of the fact that we give expression to the image and likeness of God in peculiar fashion among all of creation, on account of this fact, right, we're inclined to know the truth about God, and we're inclined to live peaceably in society. We're inclined to avoid ignorance or shun ignorance, and to avoid offending those with whom we live. And when you go about it in just this way, you see that the lower things are called up into the higher things, right? So we're inclined to food and drink, okay, but not just to like always eat and always drink, but to do so in light of higher goods like family life, right? Sexual intercourse, procreation, and education of children. So it gets called up into the life of the animal, but the life of the animal gets called up into the life of reason. So we shouldn't just seek to eat, drink, procreate whenever it seems, most suitable, but to do so in light of the fact that we have a vocation to know the truth about God, to live in political community, and to flourish, to seek peace and tranquility of order, the growth and virtue of all the citizenry, etc., etc. So when you put it in these terms, you see that the image of God actually, again, suffuses every aspect of our human existence. And so lower inclinations are called up into higher inclinations. And what is most true about us conditions everything that is present in our nature. So then, it's in light of this that we would talk about, the sacrament of marriage, or even just the natural institution of marriage. So marriage, St. Thomas will describe it as, like a union, a comprehensive union of two persons, man and woman, all right? But he describes it in terms of this inclination, which inclination is perfected by the life of virtue. And the end towards which marriage is ordered is, right, family life, procreation and education of children in the context of a family called up into a political society, ultimately to serve the ends of the God by whom and for whom we were made, whom we were, made to acknowledge, made to love, made to worship, made to praise. So here you're like, okay, where does this actually cash out? A marriage is, a union of two persons for the mutual support of the spouses, which is described in the church's tradition as one of the ends of marriage. But ultimately, that is for the procreation and education of children. So it's for the giving of life. Because like we said, this is the primordial vocation of man and woman, that in coming together in sexual union and in begetting children, they would communicate to them not only a human nature, one seeking a kind of order among all of these different desires and inclinations, but that God would give a grace so that that person would be constituted in the divine life for which he or she is destined. All right? So it's not just about the mutual support. It's mutual support for a family life sanctified by grace and ordered to worship. So this is inscribed in our nature, the language of, the complementarity of the spouses, their union for the sake of a family ordered to worship is inscribed in our nature, and it's perfected by the life of grace, and it comes to its, perfection, or it comes to its fruition in the context of Christian marriage. So then when the church says, there's no point at which same-sex unions or, same-sex attraction or same-sex unions or marriages are going to be, kind of pulled within the fold or baptized, as it were, by Christian teaching. The judgment here is about the nature which God has given, which is both a principle of identity and of destiny, which is, suited to the reception of this grace which conduces to worship. Because ultimately, we are embodied souls or ensouled bodies made to the image and likeness of God in this particular way, all right? And, sexual organs are for sexual intercourse, for procreation, as God designed it, with this whole kind of movement, this metaphysical vision in mind. So then when it comes to, the church's teaching, it's not going to change, right? But I think that's hard for many people who suffer with same-sex attraction to hear, and certainly their suffering should not be, trivialized or just turned aside, and which is why the church makes efforts in its pastoral care to address that great wound. And you see that in places like Courage or Encourage. And there, it's for us to draw distinctions between the persons, right, made to the image and likeness of God, of infinite dignity and of infinite worth, and then certain inclinations, right, which stand in need of healing in light of this natural law that we have described, and stand in need of perfection by the virtue of charity, that too, the virtue of chastity specifically, and then the acts, which themselves are gravely disordered and do not conduce to life in the sense of family life or to life in the sense of divine life, because they do not fit within the order that God has designed by nature for His glory and our salvation. So in short, the church is not going to change its teaching on this. And sometimes, as it works out its pastoral practice, you may hear certain pastors of the church say confusing things, but do not be bewildered, do not be confused, but persevere in the knowledge of the truth and your practice of your faith, and then in your intercession for, in your love of those who do suffer with same-sex attraction, and like all of us, stand in need of grace for healing and for growth. So, that's what I wanted to say. This is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, get email updates whenever cool things happen. And then if you haven't yet, please do check out a podcast to which I contribute called Godsplaining. And we have a few retreats this summer too, so you can check those out at godsplaining.org. They're to be hosted in New York and in North Carolina. You are most cordially invited, and I hope to see you there. And then finally, I wrote a book, and that book is called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. And there's a section in there about the natural law. So if you're intrigued by some of these arguments, you'll find more in that book, and it's available wherever books are sold, like in EPUB and in paperback. So that's all from me. My prayers are for you. Please pray for me, and I will catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.